So what's the best way to go around answering questions around cross-functional teams? This is what I'm going to explain to you just briefly in this video. And for this, I think it makes sense to explain to you what the cross-functional team actually means and why they ask you such questions, and then go about a couple of examples of how do you go about answering some 5 specific questions, right? So first of all, about cross-functional teams. To give you a procedural explanation of what these things actually mean. So there are cross-functional teams, which are actually teams. And the reason why someone would ask you questions around working in teams is because they want to see your interpersonal skills, right? So the core behavior, it's interpersonal skills when you're getting asked questions around cross-functional teams. Why is this important? Well, it's hugely important because if you know why they ask you a question, then you're able to give your best answers, right? So if you prepare your stories around interpersonal skills, you will be able, at least in theory, to answer questions around cross-functional teams. Now, what's a cross-functional team? Well, the easiest way to explain it is a team of people with different functions. So one developer with one tester, with one marketing person, one salesperson, with the co-founder. That's a pretty diverse type of team. That's a cross-functional team, right? The opposite of a cross-functional team is a functional team. A team of developers, a team of testers, a team of marketing people, a team of salespeople, and the founding members, if you want, or the board, right? So that's a functional team. Those are specific functions, right? Rather than people with different specialties, if you want to call them this way. Now, this being said, I believe we're ready to dive into a couple of examples of questions around this. And I believe the best way to look at these questions around working in cross-functional teams would be to look more broadly around questions around working in teams, right? And I'll explain to you why this makes sense next. And I actually used for this, I found a document on Harvard's university website with behavioral questions around the key behaviors or competencies, if you want to call them this way. The first one would be describe a situation when you are able to help out a peer or a team member, right? So when you were able to help someone from your team, right? Now, if you want to translate this question in a cross-functional context, describe a situation where you're able to help out a peer or team member cross-functionally, right? So, for instance, if you're a developer, you are going to help a tester, or you are helping your sales team, right? So this is how you go about answering this. To go even further, to be more specific, because that's the main thing with these behavioral questions. For instance, when you help your sales team to understand, you build a report for your salespeople to understand better the journey of certain users on the website. So users usually they land on a homepage, then they maybe test out a couple of freeware, and then they probably maybe go into a free trial, and then maybe they will eventually purchase that specific service. So if you make a nice chart with these how these things, how sales happen on that website, then you're able to help your salespeople and actually make a significant difference in helping them to understand how these things actually work. So this would be one example when you help a team member or someone cross-functionally, right? So even if you're a team of developers and you have a team of sales, if you help you as a developer, that someone on the other team of sales, you help someone cross-functionally, right? If you're part of the same team, that's still cross-functional because you don't have the same function, all right? So it's quite easy, if you think about it, to find such examples, right? This would be the first one. The second one, tell me about one of the toughest teams you've had to work with and what made it difficult. What did you do? Right, so this is another classic scenario of a challenge you encountered in a team, right? Again, cross-functionally in a cross-functional tester, or functionally if you want. It could also be I've never heard of a specific question, behavioral question around functional teams. They're usually around cross-functional teams, but they could be either way. So a challenging team you've worked with, right? So a challenging team you've worked with, you could pitch communication and you could pitch trust. When there's no communication, there's usually no trust, right? So when there's no trust, you have to build it somehow. right? Maybe that team was remote, right? In which case you would pitch that maybe you had a few face-to-face meetings, to really resolve those challenges, or maybe you improve communication, by mediating that interaction with a third party, various type of things. But you should understand the reason why they ask you this question, again, is about interpersonal skills, right? And your ability to build trust and be a great communicator in general. Another example here. Tell me about a new procedure you wanted your team or your group to use, and what did you do about it, right? So again, a cross-functional team, tell me about time when you convince someone of something cross-functionally, right? And the way you'd go about answering these questions, again, it's about interpersonal skills. It's about trust. How do you make people to trust you? Either you make a presentation with some interesting metrics, and you will sell yourself to them. Either you make a small demo, either you convince your manager, for instance, in a software product, to make a small trial with a limited number of users to see whether that feature worked. And if it does, you share the results, again, in the context of a presentation, and you would convince other team members cross-functionally that what you say is the best approach moving forward, right? So this two examples of how you would convince someone of something, but there's plenty more, of course. Another example of question. Tell me about a situation when you became frustrated or impatient when dealing with a peer, or team member, or other employee, and what did you do? Right? So when you become frustrated with a member who had a different function, because again, we're talking about cross-functional teams. So when there is no trust, you have to work on establishing the trust. So pretty similarly with the second question I mentioned, when you have a challenge, right? Maybe it was a virtual setting and you wanted to have a more direct or face-to-face communication where you need a bit of mediation. Now, maybe more interesting here would be to tell you how people make mistakes answering these questions. They basically put the blame on someone else. So this is the most common mistake you do answering behavioral questions around interpersonal skills, right? So he said, she said type of behavior. So this is what you want to avoid. This is the most common mistake answering such questions. And maybe finally, can you describe a situation when you needed to cooperate with others to solve a problem, and what were the results, right? So Damon had to cooperate with others cross-functionally for a specific outcome, right? So, for example, you are a technical person, you run a website, you're a developer, and for some customer of yours, the website crashes at some point, right? You don't understand where, but you have to communicate with the customer to really to be able to reproduce that specific problem, right? And this is how you would basically diffuse the situation and resolve it. Now, of course, a proper answer on this would also focus on you selling yourself as a developer, as a great developer, but the main thing would be interpersonal skills. So you would explain how you went back and forth to understand what the customer actually did there to reproduce exactly the same environment. Maybe you had some struggles to communicate and you did something more peculiar to encourage communication cross-functionally. But remember, the reason why they would ask you this, cross-functional teams, is because they want to see how you work in teams and how your interpersonal skills are, which boils down to communication and trust, right? So if you keep in mind these two keywords, I believe you will be able to answer these questions in a satisfactory manner. Now, of course, there are various other scenarios you'd want to go about this, and you could improve your answers very much based on the role and the seniority you're applying for. But I wanted to explain to you that it's impossible for someone, no matter how junior you are, not to have examples around working cross-functionally. It's unless you don't understand what this actually means, or you don't prepare at all for the job interview, that you don't have these questions. In a behavioral interview, the challenge is not to answer these questions, but to answer them in the best way possible. And usually here, specificity wins, and longer convincing answers, to the extent you can make sense for longer periods of time, are always, best. Of course, again, so long you understand why they ask you the question in the first place. So hopefully I bring a little bit of light into how do you go about answer these questions from a behavioral perspective, but I believe it's the most important perspective here. Again, hopefully you found this interesting, and hopefully and thank you very much for watching.